Hello and welcome to this last video in our lecture on biometric and token-based user authentication. In previous videos and lectures, we have talked about different techniques for user authentication, starting with passwords and then biometric approaches, and in this lecture, token-based user authentication. So because we've discussed a variety of possible techniques, of course, manufacturers have been able to choose from these different techniques when they try to secure access to their systems. So, for example, if we consider the access to so just to be clear, we're still talking about user authentication, and I'm going to just bring up a couple examples to wrap up our discussion. So, for example, if you're currently using a MacBook Pro as a first example, then you're given a couple of options to authenticate yourself. So first, you can use a password, pretty traditional technique, or you could also authenticate yourself using a biometric approach. So fingerprint. So you can just put your index finger to the sensor and then authenticate yourself that way. So this is something that you know, this is something that you are, and we've talked about these techniques before. Now, to wrap up this lecture on authentication, I want to mention now a different kind of approach where instead of choosing or letting the user choose between, say, two different authentication techniques, the system requires the user to use both of them simultaneously or one after the other. So a typical example of this approach is the example of an ATM card. So when you go to the ATM to, say, withdraw money, you both have to provide your PIN and you have to insert your ATM card into the machine. So this is an example where, as a user, you don't have a choice. You have to authenticate yourself in two ways. First, by providing something you know, which is the PIN, and two, by providing something you own, a token, like an ATM card. So this is an example of what's called multi-factor authentication. To mean that the user has to present more than one authenticator to the system, at least two or more. So notice that in the example in the previous video, the protocol that we discussed as the example of the challenge response protocol was also a multi-factor authentication protocol, because in that example, if you remember, the user both had to own the password generator device and present his or her PIN to authenticate themselves to that device. And only through the combination of both of these approaches could the user or the buyer authenticate themselves to the seller. So this was an example of a two-factor authentication because there were two factors, something the user knows, the PIN, and something the user owns, the device. So we can abbreviate two-factor authentication with the acronym 2FA. And so again, the difference between the example here and the two-factor authentication is that the OR in this case is replaced with an AND. So in particular, if one of the components of the required items is, or one of the required items is not presented to the system, if one of them is missing, then the user cannot be authenticated. And so obviously, the advantage of this approach is that it is more secure because the attacker has a much harder time to impersonate a user, because instead of having to obtain somehow their password, they have to do that and obtain their ATM card or their a password generator device, and so on and so forth. So this is clearly a step up in terms of security. And another way to strengthen the security is to make sure that the system uses different kinds of authentication techniques. So, for example, as we discussed before, something that the user knows and something that the user owns, as we saw with the two previous examples of the ATM card and the challenge response protocol. So let me wrap up this brief discussion of two-factor authentication by giving another example, and that is when someone is trying to um, authenticate themselves using their Apple ID. So the one way that this typically works is that the user has to first provide their password, the password associated and to their accounts and remembered in the system, and they also have to provide a 6-digit verification code that is sent to their trusted device, be it an iPhone or an iPad. So this is another example of multi-factor authentication. In this case, a two-factor authentication because the user has to provide two items. One is something that they know, and the other one is they can only provide with something that they own. So this is a brief overview of two-factor authentication, and this discussion and video concludes our lecture on token-based user authentication and user authentication in general.